Welcome to the Black Humanities Podcast, the podcast that centers the disciplines in humanities and the Black humans in humanities. I'm your host, Rhoda, and today I'm joined with.
Simon Hudson. Simon Hudson, a former religious studies teacher. I taught for 33 years in the humanities department in the London area.
Amazing. So, the reason I brought you here is because I have your book, History Through the Black Experience. If you'd like to tell me what inspired you to write this book, and was there a particular moment or an event that sort of like prompted you to start writing this?
I had always wanted to write such a book because I could never understand why such a book never existed. So there were individual, really good, detailed books about specific areas, specific times, individuals, and groups. But the narrative for me was far too narrow. And the reason why it's
Mm,
far too narrow is it was similar to reducing our experience, our stories, to just the Tudor period. And I didn't want it to just be the Tudor period. I wanted people to know about the Stuarts. I wanted people to know about the Victorians and the Georgians, etc. But what actually inspired me, I have to go way back to when I was 10 years old. I was painting one of Martin Luther King's speeches on my wall. And the speech started with the words, "Our method will be that of persuasion, not coercion. We will say to people, let your conscience be your guide." But at the
mm,
end of that speech, King ended with the words, and when the history books are written, they will say they lived a great people, a black people who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. As a 10-year-old, I raised my eyebrows and shook my head and thought to myself, who are these great black people? Because I knew about King, I knew about Malcolm X, and I knew about a few others, but there was no civilization that I could refer to. And that's when I started my quest. I started looking, searching, researching, reading, viewing, in a bid to feed my appetite, my interest.
I really like how you've like covered a broad like range of history. I think a lot of Black history often like focuses on like Americans, but in this book you've included like people from the Caribbean, indigenous Australians, people from like various African countries. And I find that's something that's really interesting. How did you like go about like finding these sources and even like these archives? Because especially with Black British history, people consider it sort of like undocumented.
Interestingly, it's all there. All of it's
Mm,
there. What is missing is the interest. So, for
mm,
instance, if you look at online research, you've got the BBC archives, you've
yeah.
got the Britannia archives, Encyclopedia Britannica archives, you've even got the Wikipedia archives, you've got the Guardian newspaper archives. And so what you have is you have this reservoir of information that by and large is trustworthy. And
Mm,
what happened was, as you indicated, you can't avoid the American narrative. The 20th century and so far the 21st century is the American century. That's fair enough. And there is no way I would want to get rid of Rosa Parks,
yeah.
Sojourner Truth, um, Elijah, people such as Elijah Muhammad, etc. They have their place in the history. What I wanted to do was broaden that narrative. And the reason why I wanted to broaden that narrative is there's a danger that we keep repeating the same stories and in doing so, the same mistakes. So I discovered so many individuals from places, as you've already said, such as Fiji, Papua New Guinea. You look
Mm,
at Nigeria and Ghana, and you think to yourself, well, what's that thin strip of land? Oh, that's Togo. Don't they
yeah.
have any stories to tell? Do they not have any? And then you find out about Sylvanus Olympio, the individual who helped gain their independence. he was
Mm,
assassinated by a Edema. And you think to yourself, okay, what's the story there? And
mm.
one thing just led to another. And you realize that the African narrative is incredibly rich. But then you go to somewhere like Brazil, and outside of Africa, Brazil has the largest black population in the
Yeah.
world. Yet, for the vast majority of us, you're talking about a few footballers. If you're lucky, you go beyond Pele and maybe Ronaldo. But there are so many key players in the Brazilian story, and it became quite easy. The difficulty was who not to include from the American narrative. So you weren't
Yeah.
squeezing other people out. Because, as I said, I don't want to detract from so many of the great Americans. I didn't want to do that.
Were there any challenges you faced while writing this book? Obviously, you said sourcing the material wasn't an obstacle for you, but was there anything that you found difficult?
What I had to do was avoid, and this is a problem when you have some online sites. What I wanted to do was avoid misinformation.
Mm,
And the sites that I've just mentioned, when you triangulate all of that information, you realize that it's quite easy to avoid that misinformation. An example would be the story of Muhammad Ali. He came back from the Olympics and he faced a lot of harassment, prejudice, racism, and in disgust, he told the world that he threw away his gold medal. A
yeah.
typical heroic story of Muhammad Ali. Unfortunately, he didn't throw it away. He actually lost it. He dropped it in the river.
I
But
didn't
a
know that.
story like that becomes really powerful in its by itself, its narrative. But you don't want to be upset by someone saying, "Oh, you actually got that information incorrect." And so you have to triangulate everything. So that was difficult to make sure that the details I had were accurate, were correct, and could be verified. Um, I have a lot of books. I have a huge library of books, as I said, that I started collecting and reading from the age of 10. So I had to refer to a lot of the information in those books. But again, you have to make sure that all the data included is verifiable
Yeah.
because that's when you're trying to establish a narrative. You don't want to appear as if you've taken shortcuts
Mm,
because with a sense of looking at the great, the wonderful, the brilliant, the incredible, the amazing, once you set the bar that high, if you don't find yourself able to leap that bar and you hit the bar, you're left with just the bad and the ugly. Because people will question the authenticity of your research and your writing.
yeah, that's definitely true. I find a lot of like, because I also do like sometimes history videos and stuff. Um, with short form content, I find it difficult because I want to like summarize a story to keep people's attention span, but not also like lose the essence of the person. So it's like still accurate and that the organization that make the videos for people don't see them as like people who are spreading like misinformation. So I can definitely relate to that. But how did you decide on like the style of the book? Because inside you sort of done like 1 day of history, which is
Well,
really fascinating.
well, what happened was it all started out as a calendar. I produced this calendar, what happened on this day celebrating Black history and achievement. And the calendar had over 500 entries. And people said, we love the calendar, but where are all the stories behind the entries? So I decided to write it looking at what happened on this day, January the 1st, right through to December the 31st, approximately over the last 500 years. And the things started to fall into place with my experience as a teacher. I wanted to draw in people who weren't necessarily academics, people who weren't going to read a tome, who weren't going to plow through the book. I wanted to draw in those individuals who don't normally read. That was my mission, and that was the teacher in me. There's an old saying, and unfortunately, however embarrassing it is, there's an element of truth that goes, if you want to hide something from a black man, then write
Put
it
it
in
in
a
a book.
book.
Yeah,
And
I've
so
heard
I didn't want them to have an excuse. Oh man, I can't read all of that. That's just too much. I said, no, all you have to do is read what happened on that day. And if something sparks your interest, I connected it. There was a lot of connectivity. So if I was writing about Paul Laurence Dunbar, the 19th century African American poet, he happened to know Frederick Douglass. So I would link that passage. So if you wished, you could go and read about Frederick Douglass. He also happened to know Booker T. Washington. So if you were someone who was an avid reader, you could then go on to read about Booker T. Washington. And obviously, Booker T. Washington clashed with W.E.B. Du Bois. And so, if you were an avid reader and you wanted to consume it, I did offer those strands so that people could go a lot further in their reading and their research and in their investigation. I also added areas where, if there was a really good documentary, I recommended that documentary. If there was
yeah.
a really good film, I recommended that film, etc. But what I wanted to do was open the door for those individuals who don't find reading comfortable or natural. And I wanted to say, no, no, come in, you might be surprised. There's an old saying, it goes along these lines. The man said, look, no, look, come with me. And they said, no, no. He said, look, just come closer to the edge. And they said, no, no. They said, look, just come closer to the edge. And they said, no, no. They came closer to the edge. He pushed them and they flew. And I wanted to give them the wings, the ability to realize that reading is not the enemy. It's an
Mm.
open door to being able to fly, to be able to soar, to be able to imagine, to be able to learn, to be able to investigate, to research, to rationalize.
Yeah, accessibility is like very important. Like a lot of the people I know, as we've like gotten older, a lot of people feel like they don't have time to read, or like through education, they're almost tired of reading. So I know a lot of people, and I sort of like how the book is in like bite-sized pieces, so you could like read one story at a time. It actually reminds me like when I was younger, when we were doing like things about World War One. What is it? He's like the person who was like a footballer, but also
Yeah,
became like
yeah.
a
I'm trying to remember his
sergeant.
name.
Yeah. So I used to like just find books like that in the library, but I've always like had a passion for like Black history and stuff. But I feel like finding those like small stories like geared towards like Black history is what sort of like led me to read more, and then I guess reading like the more like in-depth books and stuff like that.
For me, the depth comes in the breadth. So you're correct. You're not going to be reading Souls of Black Folk, although
Mm,
I do mention Souls of Black Folk and go into a certain amount of detail. You're not going to read Steve Biko's I Write What I Like. So each section, each entry, each individual or group, you're not going to go away with detailed information on those individuals. But what you're going to have is a very broad canvas. And that's what I felt the Black community was missing, that broad canvas. So when you start thinking about literature, and I'm talking about general English literature, you don't just stop at Shakespeare. You can turn around and say, oh, yeah, 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 I know about Dickens. Oh, yeah, and I know about Austen. And you can carry on and carry on and carry on. You can continue in that vein. And that's what I wanted. So most people will not be able to go into the details of Austen, Dickens, and
mm,
Shakespeare, etc. But in the back of their heads, they know that British literature is rich in its culture and in its breadth. And that's what I wanted to introduce in the books, that we're not just Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
There are such a huge range of artists out there and politicians out there and performers out there, inventors and scientists and explorers. And I just wanted to say, look, there's a forest, and in that forest, you'll be amazed at how many of us are trees.
On the subject of uncovering history, can you share an intriguing historical fact or story in the book that you believe more people should know about?
Wow, I should have thought about that one. Um, yeah, one of the things that I really wanted to uncover, there are something like 30 to 40 slave narratives.
Yeah.
And an awful lot of Black people, understandably, want to push back from slavery. They have huge problems navigating that 400-year period. It was very
Mm,
damaging. Um, the pain still lives on so many levels. But when you read many, and I haven't read them all, when you read these slave narratives, the power that comes out of the human character
yeah.
to be able to rise above horrendous odds is quite amazing. And everywhere you look, probably the most famous slave narrative, I guess, was Frederick Douglass, but he's just one of many. But he was so dynamic, ending up being the most photographed American in the 19th century. Very good friends and confidants of Abraham Lincoln, an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. So well spoken that people couldn't believe that he had been enslaved and
Yeah.
that he had got his own freedom, got his own way. And I just feel that those stories need to be read to give people a sense of insight, pride, and dignity. And when you do look at some of the most horrendous, painful stories of lynching, far right wing groups such as the KKK, there's
Mm,
another dignity that comes through. Hitler spoke to a young man and he said, I don't understand you black people. Why haven't you just rioted and killed every white person you see? Hitler missed that sense of dignity. It's not that sense of weakness. It's not that sense of disunity. There's an amazing sense of dignity. And I suppose when Michelle Obama says, when they go low, you go higher.
yeah.
And there's a real natural sense amongst so many individuals and groups and organizations that were able to hold their head up high. And I go back to the quote from Martin Luther King. And when the history books were written, they will say they lived a great people, a black people who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization. And it's incredible against the most horrendous odds that so many people were able to stand tall and to stand strong. Um, I do apologize because there are something like 2,500 entries in the book. But there is one individual whose name, oh, I should have written it down, whose name eludes me. But she was on the bus, the Freedom Rides. She's still
Yeah.
alive. And President Kennedy, he sent his right hand man to have a word with her and have a word with all those who were going on the Freedom Rides on the buses in the southern states. And he got them all in one room. And this representative of Kennedy was pulling his hair out in frustration. He said, do you lot not understand what you're doing? And this woman calmly turned around, I think she was 20 at the time, and says, yes, yesterday we all wrote our last will and testament, and we
Oh,
said goodbye to our parents. knowing we might not ever see them again. And I think, wow, that is just so powerful. And there were so many stories. But I do say that although I wrote about the good, the great, the brilliant, the amazing, the incredible, I also write about the bad and the ugly. They're in the
Yeah.
books as well.
Um, Perfect. So, how leading on from that point, how do you think the book challenges or expands upon traditional historical narratives? I think one thing that comes to mind is that you're showing like how much Black history there is. But is there anything else that you have in mind?
Um, Not belittling your question, but is there anything else? But I do think that's the centrality of the book, the breadth, to realize that we're not just Mary Seacole. It's Black History Month, okay?
Yeah.
Let's look at Mary Seacole, okay? Um, no, what I wanted to do was just in the same way you understandably, and in all fairness, and I just mentioned Shakespeare, but you have Mozart, you have Beethoven, you have the Beatles.
Mm,
And you're thinking, wait a minute, we have all of that as well. But I don't want them to be called the Black Mozart, the Black
yeah.
Beethoven, the Black Beatles. I wanted to elevate those performers to the same level, not to put forward a case and for people to judge it, but for people to just listen, hear, and learn and appreciate. So when I was writing, I wasn't trying to be persuasive or argumentative. I wasn't putting a rationale there. I was saying, just take a look. It speaks for itself. And so I wrote about one particular black scientist who was working along in the atomic bomb project with Oppenheimer. There were 13 black scientists. And when things were slowing down at the end of the war and Nagasaki and Hiroshima and all the rest of it had taken place, understandably, certain scientists had to be let go. And one
Mm,
of these scientists, he spent the next 2 years waiting tables because
oh,
although he was a top scientist as a black man, he found it difficult to get a job, a bit like the film Hidden
mm,
Figures. And finally, he did get a job working in the chemical industry and ended up with something like 18 patents to his name.
oh,
And
wow.
so I didn't have to get on a platform with a megaphone and start shouting his name and telling his story. I just had to just tell the story. And when once people read it, they realize, yeah, well, why are these figures hidden? Why
Mm,
don't we know more about what's going on in all these different films? The economists, the mathematicians, the engineers. And there were just so many stories, even about explorers. But then you look at something such as the Congo, which I might come back to later, and you think you hear the news about the Congo and what is a brutal mess. But a lot of people don't actually ask the question why.
yeah, because
They
of
don't
what's,
understand why the Congo is where it is today.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so why do you believe in studying humanities, particularly history, and is it important in higher education? Especially because recently a lot of people saying the humanities is not valuable and that people should focus on like STEM when it comes to education and higher education learning in general.
I think there's a real problem with education, full stop. We need to come to a consensus as to why do we educate, how do we educate, and what are we hoping to achieve when we educate. So that's quite a broad debate to be had. So, for instance, when my year sevens used to arrive in class, I used to ask them, so why are you here? And after a very short period, it was so we can get a job. And I
Yeah.
would explain to them that 90% of what you learn in your geography, you're probably never going to use in your world of work. 90% of what you use in history, you're probably never going to use in your world of work. I used to say that about maths, I used to say that about science, etc. I said, no, it's about having an understanding of the world, making sense of that world, and be able to navigate your way through that world. But as you just mentioned, the things such as the STEM subjects, and when you're looking at government data and statistics, where are we in the world league tables of education? That
Yeah.
distorts it all. That is asking a completely different question of education. And people were amazed that as a religious studies teacher, so many students were opting to take it at GCSE. And they said, but why? And I would say to the class, if I'm going to teach you something, if I'm going to introduce you to something, if I'm going to open your eyes to something, and you will not use this every single day of your life, then put your hand up, I'll listen to your argument, and you can have a free lesson. And basically, it boiled down to religions are trying to navigate their way through life to try and get to nirvana, to try and get to heaven, to try and get as much good karma as they can, avoiding bad karma, avoiding hell, and avoiding prison. And I said, every single day of your life, you will have to make decisions, and you will have to figure out whether it's the right decision, the wrong decision, whether it's the middle road, whether you stop, turn right, turn left, pause, move on forward, or go back, retrace your steps. And once they realized that it's just a lesson in life, the title Humanities, then they bought into it. And they thought, wow, this is actually fascinating. And a topic such as abortion, the ethics of it,
Yeah.
euthanasia, the ethics of it, they realized, yes, we will be facing question after question every single day, several times a day. And I feel that the arguments taking place in certain fields miss the point of education. And we need to clarify what are we hoping to achieve by educating the next generation.
So what advice would you give students considering studying in humanities? And how can educators and institutions like support people that want to go in the humanities better?
Now, are you talking about students of secondary school age to take it as an option or at
I think
university level?
maybe secondary school age, I think, because it's easier to maybe be discouraged at that stage.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you don't want to lose them before
Yeah.
you've been, as it were, converted them. I know that's a controversial term to use. Effectively, what the mantra is, you're learning about something and then you're learning from something. And that's continuous in the humanities. You learn about something and you learn from it. And if that experience is not going to build in your personal world, then humanities has failed because humanities is in an unusual position. And I will use the word unique because I often feel that people use the word unique inappropriately or incorrectly. But
Yeah.
humanities is in a unique position because, as you say, we're talking about human nature, we're talking about human beings. And that will be the center, the base, the core of everything that happens. So if you then go into music, if you then go into science, if you then go into engineering, ultimately, if you watch a film like such as Oppenheimer, it's not simply the science that matters, it's the human question.
Yeah.
That's what it ends up looking at, and that's what ends up being asked. Was it correct to unleash this power onto the world stage? And so,
Hmm.
whether it be a scientist or an engineer, and I did say I was going to go back to the question of the Congo.
Yeah.
And so, you're learning about this history, and you may or may well not know, may not know about the Berlin Conference.
Yeah,
where groups,
scramble.
Europeans essentially, white people essentially, because we're looking at Americans and Russians and others, got together for over a year to think how can we
Divide up,
carve up
yeah.
Africa. But at the end of that period, Livingstone, Dr. David Livingstone, had just gone into what would become the Congo. And King Leopold II of Belgium said, "Oh, no one wants that area. What's that area?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, you can have that then. You can have that." And humanities doesn't look at the marketization and the colonialization of the continent. It looks at the human condition of decisions and the continent.
Mm,
And what's happened is you can look at economics, and economics is important. And we've gone through a period from, I would say, from the 80s with Margaret Thatcher and Reaganomics, but it was there before, where the marketization of everything drove everything. But there are huge casualties when looking at the human being. Not everything has a pound or a dollar sign above it. And
mm.
I just felt that humanities is incredibly important because otherwise, what what are statistics telling you? Um, we just lose ourselves in the numbers.
Yeah, definitely. I think uh humanity sort of gives an explanation and it's like the reason why people even engage in things like philosophy and politics in general. So I think the humanities is definitely important in that respect. Speaking of the humanities, um, have you had any people sort of reach out to your book and respond positively? Any like meaningful reactions you've got from sort of like documenting these histories?
I have been so, I say, blessed and
Yeah.
so fortunate. The number of people that have come up to me. One of the biggest surprises, there are about 5 people that mentioned that they read the book daily to a
Oh,
partner or to an elder relative who has dementia. And they
oh,
said
wow.
they just come alive. And I was incredibly surprised because that wasn't on my radar at all.
Yeah.
And each individual, and one woman came up to me at an event and said, "Oh, I read the book to my granddad, and for the hour he just comes alive. He just can, and it's not even that he was alive at the time, but the stories take him to a time, a place, a feeling, a thought that he had obviously experienced or had at some time." Then there are a lot of people who say thank you because of the power of affirmation, who you are. All of a sudden, they think, "Wow, this is quite extraordinary." And I retell a story where I was upstate in New York in a small town called Carmel, not the California Carmel. And I was looking in the shop window with a young white German. And this was 1986. And all of a sudden, I heard the siren of a police car just whoo behind me. And this policeman got out of his car with his big everlasting guns by his side. And he started throwing epithets at me, using the N word and saying, "What
Oh,
the hell are you doing on the street?" And I'm thinking, what? And I turned round to him and I said, "Who the hell do you think you are?" And the reason why I all of a sudden turned into this Marvel Comics superhero with a shield of invincibility around me was bizarrely because in my back pocket I had my British passport. And
yeah.
even though I had no time whatsoever for Margaret Thatcher, she was on my right shoulder. And although I had no time whatsoever for Churchill, he was sat on my left shoulder. And I said, don't you ever talk to me like that again. I'm English, and you need to think twice. And I didn't say I'm British, I said I'm English. And it was
Yeah.
an epiphany moment for me. How important to have a sense of being and have a secure sense of roots so that when this hurricane came towards me, I stood strong. And I stood strong. It was absolutely bizarre because I had my British passport in my back pocket. And I can see why a lot of black people don't have that going on in the back of their head because they can't turn around and lean back on a whole encyclopedia of giants
Yeah.
themselves. Yeah, I can stand tall and stand proud and stand strong. And yeah, it was a moment for me. And I wanted to replay that moment in the book with as many readers as possible so that they too could turn around and they didn't have to clutch at thin air for authenticity and for verification. And you hear it all the time. And I'm thinking, no, there are so many heroes, so many icons that you can look to and look at and indeed learn from and follow. And as Maya Angelou says, and still you rise.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to people to get from the book. And many people have said that that's what they get. And even if they're not conscious of it, subliminally it creeps up on them.
I don't know if you know Pauline Black from the Selectors,
Yes, yeah.
but
Well, not personally, but yeah,
I read her biography like years and years ago, and she had a similar story where she was touring in America and she was sort of like profiled by the police. Then they heard her British accent and sort of like calmed down like right away. And it's like crazy that she went through that. But she was like a very powerful figure because she sort of like came into her blackness like a lot later in life because she was like adopted and like some other stuff. But in that moment, she sort of like had that same thing of like staying strong and being like proud in her blackness to like also in the same way sort of proclaim that she's British at the same time. But yeah, that just reminded me a lot
yeah.
of that story.
It's
Um,
so easy. It's so easy, and I mentioned this with the slave narratives, to end up being ashamed of your blackness.
mm,
Because when Tarzan is in the jungle, this one white man, he's not just in the jungle, but he's the king of the jungle.
yeah,
And history tells us about 400 years of slavery. It tells us about 400 years of empire building and colonialism. And we always appear to be the minions at the bottom of the pyramid. And so it's very easy to be crushed by that narrative and not to know that there was and there is a great people that injected new meaning and dignity in the because these individuals, for so many of us, remain invisible. And it's so easy to not be able to stand tall. Bizarrely, I was able to stand tall from a very early age. I mentioned the Martin Luther King quote because I attended the black church. And so all around me, there was this immediate black community. Now, they didn't develop this and build on it, but it gave me enough support to make it through. So while all these names were being called and thrown at me, I was able to engage in a wider community. So there were only three black people in my secondary school, but in that wider community, I was one of 100.
yeah.
And so it gave me substance, it gave me a family.
Mm.
And so that was a really good starting point.
What advice would you give to people trying to get into your field, like to like become a writer, maybe like a history writer specifically, but you can broaden it if you want to write
Um,
in general.
Simply to read. There's a
Yeah.
saying, if a child is to succeed as they progress through school, it becomes critical for them to possess or at least be orientated towards the elaborated code. Basil Bernstein said that. And effectively, if you are not reading, you're not learning or absorbing the tools of engagement. You're not opening up your mind and your imagination and your thoughts. So you'll hear this on the news continuously. Oh, I just cannot imagine what it would be like to be in that person's shoes. Writers imagine it all the time. um, you have people writing about the most horrendous experiences in the First World War. They were never there because their minds are being expanded so that they can have this empathy, this sympathy. They can go back in time. They can go forward in time. They can
Mm.
know what it's like to fly and to do things which they thought would never actually happen. And so the key to it is to engage, find areas that you really enjoy so that you can read and develop those skills, that mindset.
Amazing. Are there any books that you would recommend for the audience to sort of get a wider view of your field? Not necessarily about writing, but just in general that you would recommend.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Um, Totally outside of the field, but connected to humanities, George Orwell's 1984. I just
Oh.
think that's just a giant of a book that if you can read it. Um, but in relation to Black Power and Black Theology, who wrote that? The South African, I don't remember his name, but Alan Bosak wrote that, Black Power and Black Theology. Souls of Black Folk, I thought was one of the towering books by W.E.B. Du Bois. And I ended up reading a lot of Martin Luther King and also a lot of Desmond Tutu. I felt that they were so thought provoking and level headed and intelligent and reasoned in
Mm.
their approach and arguments. So, although you'll read something like Malcolm X's autobiography, he's tripping from A to B to C to D and stumbling to E to F before he gets to where he wants to be. And so it's inspirational, but I don't think it guides you in a similar way. But the ones that I've mentioned, and Frederick Douglass's, I think he wrote 3 autobiographies. They're all worth visiting as well. But there's so much out there. But those, yeah, those are some that I would highlight.
Are you working on any new projects or books that we can look forward to that you want to quickly shout out or discuss?
But interestingly, an ex-pupil of mine, Michelle de Leon, who's the CEO of World Afro Day, she got in
Oh,
touch with me and she wants to write a book and she wants me to assist in that book, looking at issues relating to hair and the power and the empowerment of hair. So that's something that we are looking at and yeah, working on at this moment as we speak.
that will be really fascinating. Because a lot of people have been talking about like slavery and like the braiding patterns, how that would signify like the slave routes. And then also like my background's West African, so just like learning about the different like hairstyles that relate to like royalty and whatever. Yeah, that really sounds fascinating. I think like hair is a big part of Black culture and how we sort of like express our identity. So yeah, any personal advice to the public, many maybe like prospective humanities students, graduates, and like their parents, etc.
Interestingly, in very simple terms, and this is not a sales pitch, but I would say have a look at my book
Yeah.
because every day offers something new, something different. So one minute you're in Papua New Guinea, the next minute you're in Fiji, the next minute you're in Togo, the next minute you're in South Africa. One minute you're looking at an explorer, the next minute you're looking at a reggae artist, the next minute you're looking at an explorer. I'm sorry, I said that. I'm a scientist, etc. So what I have continually said, it's about the breadth. So it's not about exceptions to the rule, because everyone can point to an exception to the rule. I want to be part of the rule.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, on the back of my book, I wrote, we have always been here. Black people have always been part of the historical narrative. We have had successes and failures, pains and delights, achievements and loss, adventure and invention, creativity and wisdom. We have kings and queens, chiefs and politicians, scientists, writers, singers, dancers. Indeed, we have always been present in the human story. This book aims to shine a light, illuminating stories of courage, often against incredible odds, capturing experiences from around the world, from people of Black heritage, looking at the great, the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the ugly. That's yeah, that's what I want it to be about.
Perfect. Thank you for your time today.
And thank you
Um,
for inviting me to speak.
yeah, it's been a good episode and I've learned a lot. Learned some new history that I didn't know before.